Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 3 of Plato's Republic. Like Book 2 picking up from Book 1, Book 3 picks up from Book 2. So the end of Book 2, as I talked about in my video on that book, Socrates talks about the types of stories that should be allowed in the ideal city. And in particular, the stories that are allowed should have a pedagogical purpose for training the guardians of the city. Book 3 is very much concerned with the education of the guardians and the education of people in the ideal city in general. Because ultimately, what he envisions is guardians who are ethical, who are dedicated to the good of the city-state as a whole. And actually, toward the end of Book 3, he makes this fairly explicit. He says, "Then we must choose from among our guardians those men who, upon examination, seem most of all to believe throughout their lives that they must eagerly pursue what is advantageous to the city and be wholly unwilling to do the opposite." So ultimately, this is where Socrates sort of comes down in terms of what an ideal leader or ruler should be. Is it someone who is dedicated to the good of the city-state on the fundamental belief that what benefits the city-state is beneficial to that guardian and to everyone as a collective? Now, Socrates is very concerned in Book 3 about how to instill these values. And this is a book primarily about his educational philosophy, which I will tell you right now, I am not necessarily in agreement with about a lot of the things that Socrates talks about in this book. But there is one thing he talks about here that I do think is really significant. And this is also toward the end of Book 3. He talks about the importance of balance in education. And he's specifically concerned about the balance between physical and mental training. So he is concerned, basically this is the sort of classic, he's concerned about the classic meathead jock versus wimpy nerd dichotomy, right, of high school movies and TV shows. The vicious bullying jock who's never had a thought in their mind versus the scrawny 98-pound math nerd who gets stuffed in their locker every week. Socrates says either of these two are detrimental to the city. You want a smart jock. You want someone who is physically strong and resilient and capable of actually engaging the enemy in combat, but who's also a thinker. You want a samurai, basically. But Socrates doesn't obviously use the term samurai, but you want a smart warrior. U.S. Army Rangers or Special Forces. These people, these different sort of military traditions that place a lot of emphasis on education, critical thinking, creativity, knowledge, etc., alongside strenuous physical training. This is essentially what Socrates is envisioning. But that's not necessarily the core of his educational philosophy in the Republic, both in books 2 and 3. Ultimately, he advocates an extremely tightly controlled set of narratives or style of art and storytelling that would be allowed. The gods can only be good. They can never deceive, they can never lie, they can never do whatever. And he essentially makes the argument that the gods by their nature are inherently good, and therefore any story in which they do anything bad must be a lie. So he advocates taking out of, for instance, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, anything in which the gods do anything negative. You simply take those out because they're inherently lies. The gods are all beneficent, all good, all beneficial. Therefore, they can't do anything wrong. The Book of Job would clearly not survive Socrates' editorial process here. The same thing with heroes. Heroes and regular humans become much more central in Book 3, whereas Book 2 really has more of the section about how the gods are inherently good, and no one would be allowed to tell stories in which they do anything wrong. Book 3 shifts toward human and sort of demigod characters more. Heroes in the stories must also be good and noble and virtuous and courageous, etc., etc. So we take out of the Iliad everything where Achilles does anything ethically questionable, where he desecrates Hector's body by dragging it behind his chariot. Nope, cut that out, because Achilles is a hero, and heroes can only do good things. Socrates, again, attempts to justify this through the claim that by their nature a hero is good, and therefore it must be a lie to say they would do something wrong. But ultimately this is pedagogical. Socrates views the purpose of these stories as to train the guardians to be good, ethical rulers and leaders. So, for instance, here he says, "Nor must Phoenix, the tutor of Achilles, be praised as speaking with moderation when he advises him to take the gifts and defend the Achaeans, but not to give up his anger without gifts. Nor should we think that such things to be worthy of Achilles himself. Nor would we agree that he was such a money lover that he would accept the gifts of Agamemnon or release the corpse of Hector for a ransom, but not otherwise." The person who's responding, who is probably still Glaucon, but I'm not 100% sure, says it certainly isn't right to praise such things. And then Socrates says, "It's only out of respect for Homer, indeed, that I hesitate to say that it is positively impious to accuse Achilles of such things, or to believe others would say them." So again, this is really kind of the core of Socrates' perspective on storytelling and myth, or legend, is the idea that it must conform to particular patterns of positive behavior. The problem is, this is going to lead to extraordinarily one-dimensional characters and stories. I mean, let's take the myth of Oedipus. For instance, you can't have the myth of Oedipus without having a conflicted character. You can't have Aeschylus's Oresteia. And Socrates does talk more about drama later on, I think, in the Republic. He's not a huge fan of it, but you couldn't have that story in which Agamemnon is killed by Clytemnestra and then Clytemnestra is killed by Orestes. You can't have that story in Plato's Republic, in Socrates' Republic, the ideal city here, because these are conflicts for the characters. These are negative things that they do, even if these are meant to ultimately have positive purposes. These, again, the characters that Socrates is envisioning here are extraordinarily one-dimensional, which is not going to make for great art or literature. And this is even true when a particular depiction of a character, a god, a hero, a human, is meant to teach a negative lesson. Because one of the things that Socrates mentions as a story to be banned is, what about the chaining together of Ares and Aphrodite by Hephaestus, also the result of sexual passion? And then Glaucon says, no, by God, none of that seems suitable to me. There's other things about Zeus raping people, and I'm fine with fuck that shit. Get that shit right out of there. But, like, the story in which Hephaestus creates an incredibly fine, unbreakable net to trap his wife Aphrodite and Ares in bed together, so that the rest of the gods will mock them. Like, that's a moral story. So, yes, the gods are doing bad things because Aphrodite is cheating on Hephaestus, and Aphrodite and Ares are siblings. But the gods are always fucking each other. They're always fucking siblings, parents, and whatever. It's messed up. But, like, that, it's a moral story. Like, it's not a story meant to be like, oh, look how awesome it is that Aphrodite's cheating on Hephaestus with her brother. It's a story that's meant to be like, maybe don't do that. See, it's bad when the gods do that, and the other gods are going to laugh at them when they're trapped in bed together, etc., etc. So, like, even that sort of notion that, like, a story could have a negative pedagogical purpose, or that it could teach a lesson through a negative moral. Don't do this thing. Socrates sees no place for that in the ideal city, in part because he is convinced that with negative stories like this, the Guardians might be drawn to the negative aspects of it. And so they only should be exposed to positive moral messages in their stories. And that's actually quite interesting, because one of the stories about the Buddha is that his father wanted him to remain in the palace and be a great prince, and so he basically prevented anything negative from coming anywhere near Siddhartha. Like, he had the streets swept when Siddhartha was going to be going out, so that nothing bad would ever be visible to his son. And yet, when Siddhartha sees an old man and a sick man and a corpse, he's overwhelmed by that experience, because he's got no frame of reference for making sense of this. It seems like Socrates is setting the Guardians up for the same kind of thing here. Like, there's a huge pedagogical risk in this, of saying only give them positive moral images, because it doesn't give them a framework for understanding negative real-world experiences. It's like, another analogy is like the immune system, right? Like, they say it's beneficial as a kid to go out and, like, play in the dirt and rub snot on each other, whatever I don't know what kids do. Kids are gross, but you know what I mean. Like, it's beneficial to go out and like be exposed to germs and stuff because it builds up your immune system. You need the negatives in order to create a framework in which you can deal with the actual negative things you encounter in the world. And Socrates seems to be ignoring that idea in favor of the sort of let's insulate them in a cushion of just good stories. So I think there's a huge flaw in Socrates' pedagogical approach that he's envisioning for the ideal city. But the other thing about his educational approach that's in book 3, and that's really significant, is we get this idea of platonic love, what we would now call platonic love. Well, okay, so we wouldn't call it platonic love because we tend to misuse the term. We tend to today use the term platonic love to mean friendship, which is not quite wrong, but it's also not quite right. So for Plato, for Socrates, in Plato's Republic, also this is central to Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, which I've done a video on. Platonic love here is pederastic love. That is, it's the love between an adult man and a young man or boy, usually like early adolescence. What Plato ultimately are, because usually these were sexual relationships in addition to training the young man for military service, for the responsibilities of citizenship, whatever it was. So these were relationships that were very, very standard in ancient Greece, very, very standard in ancient Athens, and they served an educational function. Socrates here, as in Phaedrus, basically says you should do that, but without sex. Not because he has any sort of moral problem necessarily with what we would call pedophilia, but because he says sexual desire clouds the purity of that educational experience. Sexual desire compromises the desire on the part of the older man to genuinely benefit the younger man and to raise him, educate him correctly. Sexual desire, because it's in some ways selfish, because it's a kind of madness, and he talks much more about that in Phaedrus, can compromise that ideally dispassionate relationship, educational relationship. Now, Socrates is perfectly open to the idea that there may be some degree of sexual or quasi-sexual contact between the two, but ideally he wants that sexual contact repressed in the interests of the educational role.